Okay, so good. So if you've done the soft chart, you know a little bit. They're from plant mass, and let's talk. I think that's very fascinating because I think we're getting more and more toward biofuels these days. Of course. Now let's go on. So the word biofuel, you can imagine, has two components to it, right? You have biology or biomatter, whatever you can think of. Fuel is energy source, right? So the definition for biofuel is any fuel with a minimum of 80% from living organism, biomass, okay? But the key thing is not just about from organism. It has to be harvested within 10 years. Why is that? Because think about petroleum and fossil fuel, are they not also from bioorganism? Remember, they're from plants that die a long time ago or animal that die a long time ago, right? So biofuel is not just about from organism, it has to be recent within 10 years versus fossil fuels, petroleum. It is also from biomass, but it is like thousands and millions of years ago. And so that is not considered biofuel. And why is it has to be recent? Because recent means these kind of biomass is renewable. That means you can keep growing it and you can keep using it. Versus petroleum down here, once you use it, it's done because you cannot grow these biomass because it's like thousands of years ago, right? So for a layman, for regular general public, the definition is you get the fuel from existing biomass. Well, when they say carbon, they're thinking about the biomass, the carbon in the biomass. Okay. So the two examples exist right now is bioethanol and biodiesel. Now, in this lab here, we're going to focus on bioethanol. So bioethanol is it's two component again. You have biology, right? So you're using biomass to generate ethanol, which is an alcohol, okay? And this alcohol is called ethyl alcohol. It's what you actually drink if you like to drink. Um, in United States, most of the bioethanol is made from corn. That's why we produce so much corn, not just to feed the cattle, but to use it to make bioethanol. Now, if you ever go pump gas into your car, you have noticed all these letters or numbers. E95, the one that we usually use is 87, right? 89, and then the most expensive is it 90, 95? Is the most expensive, right? So these numbers is telling you the percent of petroleum versus alcohol. So if you pump 87, it's telling you there's 87% of petroleum or gasoline, and then the rest is additive, including alcohol. So you can imagine why the bigger the number is, the more expensive because you have more petroleum in it. Now, the reason they added to gasoline, the bioethanol is added to gasoline is because it minimizes emission. So let's talk about footprint in a minute. So what are some of the advantages of biofuels? Of course, they are renewable because those plants you can keep growing and keep using them, right? But petroleum or coal, they're not renewable. Once you use it up, that's gone, right? Um, and they the emission is better. Biofuel, they produce less CO2 or greenhouse gas. The best thing is it's biodegradable. Think about it. When you spill petroleum a long time ago, remember you see that news about, is it Exxon or BP have a crack in the um, pipe down in the ocean and it make a huge pollution, and they have to pay a lot of money to fix it. Now, the good thing about biofuel is if you spill it or there's anything goes wrong with it, it's biodegradable. It just degrade. It's not gonna harm the environment at all. So why are the government interested in biofuel? Okay, number one, we need to do something about the climate change, right? So one way to do it is to decrease our CO2 output, and biofuel can help us to do that. Number two, think about where petroleum comes from, right? It's mostly from Middle East. And as United States requires so much petroleum for our cars and other stuff, we don't really want to rely on another country for our energy source. And if because if those countries decide to increase the price on us, then it will affect our economy. And plus, those countries usually Middle East, remember, they're usually not very politically stable. So if anything goes wrong over there, they have a war or something, the supply might be affected. So that will affect our economy too. Um, the other thing that I don't think people think about much is there's a lot of farm activity focus on growing crops for food, right? But there's some land, you just can't grow anything for food because it's not rich enough. And then there's not enough water. But those land are perfect to grow crops for biofuels because you can use wheat or stuff that is hard to, um, that is really easy to grow, but you can't eat, stuff like that. So then all the lands can be used. Now, so what are biomass? Biomass is in this chapter here, we're going to focus mostly on plant, but of course, um, it can be from animal, right? So plants are able to use solar energy, sun energy, to convert into chemical energy. Remember that? We kind of talked about that last time. And in their carbon-carbon bond, okay? So that's what I'm saying. The energy in the sun is captured by photosynthesis in those carbon-carbon bond. So of course you have wood. When you burn wood, that's the most ancient biomass. A lot of people in the old days without electricity, they burn woods for heat, for cooking, and stuff like this. So wood, of course, is a direct biomass. But there's some non-direct biomass that you don't really burn. This is the kind we're going to focus on. It's non-woody, for example, corn, sugar cane, and stuff like this. That is processed to make biofuels. Okay. Now, different countries have different biomass for biofuels. Okay, so United States is not the only country that make biofuel. Actually, it's worldwide because people are seeing how valuable it is. So for United States, you can guess we do a lot of corn, right? But you haven't heard of switchgrass, which is a weed that is really easy to grow. Like I said, it doesn't require a lot of water. And soybeans, of course, we're big on that too because our cattle also eat soybeans. Brazil is really big on sugarcane. Europe, sugar beet and wheat, and then China are these two things. So a lot of these things, except switchgrass or soybeans, they're either really sweet like sugar beet, sugar cane, or really starchy like these two guys. And there's a reason why. Okay. I already talked about this, that biofuels, especially bioethanol, are added to gasoline to improve emission and clean the engine quite well too. And the number, remember, you see in the gasoline pump is what it means. Now let's look at emission. So this is petroleum. Look at how high the emission is. When we talk about emission, we talk about emission of greenhouse gas, especially CO2. Okay, if you use corn ethanol, which is what we are using right now in United States, you can see that it reduces a little bit if you use corn ethanol for from natural gas, and this is average, and it reduce a little bit. Okay, this is sugar cane ethanol, which is pretty good. Now the lab, for this lab, what we're doing is this part here. We're using cellulosic biomass. Okay, and see how the reduction is 86%. So we're focusing on a biomass that this is a word, right? It's a big word you haven't seen, but I bet you know what it means. This should remind you of cellulose, right? If you cover the IC at the end and add an E, that becomes cellulose. So the biomass that you need to use for this lab is going to be a plant mass that composed of cellulose and is usually not edible. So that's why the reduction is so high. Okay, so let's take a quick look at bioethanol production here. So there are 3 generations. The first generation here, they use sugar-rich biomass like sugarcane, right? Beets. What is this one? Sorghum, sweet sorghum, and then or starchy material. Now, if you remember from chapter, I think it's chapter 3 in carb, starch is just a bunch of glucose linked together, remember? In alpha glycosidic linkage, remember that? So these two things actually is the same, except this is sugar, this is starch, which is essentially the same as sugar. Um, and I'm going to talk about why they focus on starchy stuff in a minute. And the second generation is what we're doing in this lab. They're using cellulosic biomass. For example, grass that nobody eats, and stuff that you usually throw away, and that is contain a lot of cellulose. Now, do you remember what is in common between cellulose and starch from the carb chapter? Do you remember what cellulose is composed of? Come on, people. You need to know that for final exam, you know. Right on. Yep. Cellulose is composed of glucose. Starch is composed of glucose, but starch has alpha glycosidic linkage to link all the glucose together, and cellulose, the glucose are linked together by beta glycosidic linkage. Okay, so think about it, they both have glucose, right? So in theory, the glucose in cellulose can be used for energy if we know how. Agree? So that's why the second generation comes about, because scientists start to realize that there's a bunch of glucose in plants that we don't usually use anyway, so we might as well try to use them. So we don't have to rely on the starchy stuff. Now the third generation biomass is what NREL is focusing on. Now, if you don't know about NREL, it's National Renewable Energy Lab, which is in Golden, right? The focus is a government facility, government lab. They focus on renewable energy. So one of the research that they do is to grow a bunch of algae. Those are tiny, tiny green single cell plants, okay? And you see them everywhere in plants. That's what make the plant. In ponds. That's what make the pond water green. See, this is single cell algae that going through photosynthesis, and the third generation is looking at how do they grow algae, because you can grow a lot of it really fast, and to use that for biofuel. Okay. What was I going to say here? The the problem about the first generation biofuel, can you see a problem here? Look at the stuff they use. They're all edible. So you are competing, I should say you're dipping into the food source. So if we're using these kind of crops to make biofuels, we're taking it away from feeding our population, aren't we? So the first generation is phasing out because we don't make enough to feed our population and make biofuel at the same time. So that's why they're focusing on the third generation and the second generation, because all of these stuff, well, nobody eats algae, right? And second generation, the stuff they usually throw away anyway, So that's why they're phasing out the first generation. Right? Here is again first generation sugary stuff, starchy stuff, and remember starch is just a bunch of sugar anyway. Um, we are the first, we are the leading producer of corn ethanol. 40%, look at this number, 40% of our corn crop are being used to make bioethanol. And so it's 40% less to feed the cattle or people, right? So competition for food use. The one of the worst thing about first generation is think about it, for corn to be used for bioethanol, what you can use? You can only use the kernel. So only certain part of the plants is used for biofuel, and the rest you have to throw away. So you're wasting a lot of stuff, right? You grow that corn. Think about a corn. If you think about growing corn, you have this huge stalk in the bottom, and then leaves, and then those kernels is just like what 1/10 of the whole plant. So you're using just a tiny portion of the plant to make biofuel, and the rest you have to throw away, which is not good at all. Now, second generation biofuel is what, like, keep telling you, I hope you get it by now, is what we're doing in this lab. So we focus on biomass that are not edible. And they're like fibers that people can't really digest anyway. And these fibers are in plant cell wall. Plant cell wall has cellulose, remember? And the good thing about this kind of biomass, we can use the entire plant. For example, in a corn, right? They use the corn kernel to feed cattle, and the rest of the plants, a bunch of cellulose, right? They're not edible. So that the rest of the whole corn plant can be used for this kind of biofuel. Okay, so there's no waste, and we only use non-food crops, stuff that people and animal cannot eat, that grow on land that you cannot grow anything else anyway. Okay, so that's way better than first generation. Now, right now, can you guys think of any kind of second generation biomass? The example I gave already is the corn husk or corn stalk, after you done with the kernels. But think about some of the plant biomass that you cannot eat. You usually throw away in a daily life, but there are a lot of cellulose in it. Just give me now everybody give me at least one example now. Okay, corn cobs, correct. Good, Harley. Orange peels are correct. Stuff you don't eat. Come on, everybody give me one. Watermelon, right? Yup, right on. Just remember stuff that you cannot eat and you usually throw away. So we have 3 examples. Let's do one more. Come on, one more. Yeah, avocado skin. I think you guys are getting the gist of it, right? Avocado skins, very good. You can think about, along the same line, onion skins or um, some of the stuff that you throw away every day, but they're perfectly good. Now, if you look at the first two generation of biofuels, the first one is sugary, starchy stuff, right? The second generation is cellulose containing biomass. And the one thing they all have in common is they all contain glucose, right? Just in different forms. So cellulose is beta glycosidic linkage. Yep, Samantha, banana peel is right on too. You guys got it. So this is uh, glucose linked by beta glycosidic linkage, and this is glucose linked by alpha glycosidic linkage, right? So they all have glucose. So why do we want glucose? I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Third generation biofuel. I talk about the single cell algae. Now, algae is very curious. For some of you guys that are vegetarian, but you still want to eat some sort of fish oil, you cannot eat fish oil because fish is not vegetable, right? It turned out that a lot of vegetarian will take algae fish oil. So algae make a similar oil to fish that has DHA. So for those of you that are vegetarian, you can consider DHA from algae. So algae make oil that can be extracted and be used as biodiesel. So some algae can do that. And the other great thing about algae is that algae can be genetically manipulated. That means we can change because it's single cell, right? It's pretty small. So the DNA is not as complicated as human or eukaryotic cells. So we can genetically or we can change some of the algae's gene to make it produce more oil or more ethanol. Okay. So that's one thing. Or we can make it grow faster, or we can make it grow with less nutrient or less sunlight, whatever you want to do. So you can genetically manipulate them, alter them so they can do what you want them to do. Now, so far, algae have been used to produce over 9,000 gallons of biofuel per acre, which is really good. So the way they take or they grow algae is to grow in a tank. You can think about like a small swimming pool, right? Like in a regular house, you have this little circle or square. I don't know what you have. I think it's circle. Above ground pool, they do the same thing. So they have this kind of tank that have a lot of water in it. They grow algae in it, and which is very land efficient when you think about it. Now, so let's talk a little bit about biotech. Now, the definition for biotech, well, once again, you see biology here, right? Technology here. The definition for biotech is that you're using biological system to solve problems or make useful products for human beings, for our societies. So the goal of biotechnology is to heal, to make medicine, to make biofuel, to feed the world, so to increase the yield of crops so we can feed more people. So this here is what you heard so much about GMO. So it's genetically modified plants that can resist drought, can resist pests, so they can grow more without losing a lot of crops in a certain situation. So that's the feeding part. The healing part is biotech has been used to manipulate. The example I gave a long time ago is they manipulate bacteria. So nowadays, insulins, human insulins that diabetic used to inject themselves every day is made from bacteria, and it's all because biotech are able to engineer bacteria in a way that um, they can express human insulin gene. Now, fuel is biofuels that we are talking about right now. Now, we already touched on this. So biotech allow we change the algae's genes so they can do stuff we want, and they can do the same thing to plants. right? So they can resist disease and they can grow faster and stuff like this. Um, and they can also engineering different enzymes to make the processing, the manufacturing steps faster too. So biotech has a lot to do with biofuel. Without biotech, there won't be any biofuels. Okay. So let's look at the general steps how you make biofuel from biomass. Okay, so you start with some sort of cellulose biomass. Okay, for example, some of you have, let's say avocado skin. Now you imagine this is a tree. We can take the tree bark or avocado skin, whatever it is, which composed of mostly cellulose, right? The first step is pre-treatment. In this lab, when we pre-treat, what we're doing is we cook them in a boiling water bath. Okay, so we kind of boil the biomass a little bit, and then that will allow the cellulose to be softened, to be broken down a little, and then we'll add specific enzyme to chew up the cellulose. Okay, and then after that, chewing up the cellulose will release the glucose. So then we can do fermentation, and after fermentation, you have ethanol. So let's talk about step by step. Now here is what plant cell walls actually look like. I've been focusing on cellulose, which is these green rods here. But you understand in plant cell walls, there's other components too. There pectin here, you can see that pectin is these little green line. They have hemicellulose. There's a lot of components in plant cell walls, not just cellulose. Although cellulose is the major component, but there are other stuff too holding it together, okay? And plant cell walls, as you know, provide protection to the plant and also provide structure, right? Structure to the plant. And where do you find cellulose? Basically, let me draw it for you. Remember that long time ago we learned plant cell kind of like this, right? Right, with a little nucleus here. Now the square part here is this is a single plant cell. It's a the plant cell wall, and of course there's plasma membrane right against the cell wall. Remember when you did the LODR experiment, when you add 10% salt. Do you remember what happened? When you add 10% salt, the water leave the cell, right? Because 10% salt is hypertonic to the cell. So as water leaves the cell, the cell membrane shrink. So you can actually see the cell membrane and all the little chloroplasts shrink. And then you can still see the square shape of the cell wall unchanged. So these cell walls is what you're looking at here. You have the cellulose in the structure cell wall here for each plant cell. Okay, so that's what you're getting at. So this is a quick review. Once again, this is individuals plant cells, and cell wall is the outermost layer, and you have cellulose in those cell wall. Now cellulose is, remember, is glucose, but they are in parallel strands, stabilizing by hydrogen bond. Remember that? So this is what it's showing you. This is a glucose fiber, but it composed of many fibers like this, stabilized by hydrogen bonds. Now, so since we cannot actually do the lab for this, so what I would do is you will still go through the design process. So this project here is for you to design your own lab. So you have to come up with it with your own question. Remember the scientific method is you number one have a question, right? Number two, you have a hypothesis to answer the question you have. Number three, based on the hypothesis, you make a prediction, okay? And then you will run the experiment to test your hypothesis. And then you collect your data at the end of the experiment to see whether your hypothesis is correct or not, right? So in this lab here, you will get to pick the biomass that you're interested in trying. Okay. So since we are not actually running the lab, so what I will do is I'll give you a list of choice of biomass. So you pick the one you think will make the most alcohol. And so biomass is one thing that you can make a choice. The other thing we're going to talk more about is you can pick enzymes. We have a list of enzymes that you can pick. I think we have 4 or 5 different enzymes. You can pick those enzymes and to figure out which enzymes with the biomass you pick will give you the most alcohol. Okay, so the goal of the lab is to generate the most alcohol possible. Okay, so since I said you're not running the lab, so what I would do is I collect some of the old data from the previous semesters with real data from students group. So I'll give you those biomass choices based on the previous students uh, lab data. And then when, let's say if I give you a choice of using, I don't know, orange peel, right? You pick orange peel and then you pick a certain enzyme. And then I also will give you a list of enzymes, right? So I would say, okay, this student group in the previous semester use orange peel plus these 2 enzymes. And if you think what they're doing is what you want, you pick that group and then you do some research on it, answer a few questions, and I'll give you their data. So then you can graph and then answer the rest of the questions. So that's how we're going to do it. So I give you different scenario and you pick the one that you think will give you the most, right? And then you know whether it's true. But don't worry about it. If it's a little confusing now, you'll get clearer and clearer because I'll give you examples along the way. Okay. So let's look at it. So you pick a biomass. Of course, you have to grind up the biomass into tiny pieces first. Okay. And then I say you have to cook it. Now, cooking it just like your vegetables, right? When you cook it, it becomes softer, easier to digest. And that's why we have to cook it first after you grind it up. Cook it, and then we use enzymes, different kinds. And the choices of enzyme, you will make choices based on what you know about the plant cell wall. Remember, I just showed you besides cellulose, there are pectin in there, there are other stuff in there. So you have to look at the component of the plant cell walls to make the best choice of the enzymes. Okay. And then after you break down the cellulose with enzyme, it will release all the glucose you want. So the goal is you want to get as much glucose out as possible in this step, in the enzyme digestion step. And then all the sugar is going to use to feed yeast. It will ferment the sugar to alcohol. Okay, so here's alcohol, right? Now we're going to talk about this. That's the cellulose, the cell wall, really complicated. Cooking it, open up the fibers, making it softer, better for digestion. Hydrolysis, now here's cellulose again. So in hydrolysis, look at these little hungry little Pac-Man here. So it's different enzyme that can work on the fiber. So I have examples here. Can eat up the fibers and release individual glucose. Now, so what will break down cellulose? The enzyme that will break down cellulose is called cellulase, right? Just change the O to A. And here are some examples. So mushroom grow on woody tree barks, right? So mushroom actually produce quite a bit of cellulase because it has to digest the tree barks to get the glucose from tree barks to grow into mushroom. Now, do you know what this is? Yep, this is termite. And what does termite eat? Termite eats wood. Wood is cellulose. So in termite stomach, actually there's a bunch of cellulase. So when they eat the wood, they can digest the cellulose to become glucose that they can use. Now you can see this picture clearly. This is a cow, of course. But this cow is special because they open a hole on the side of the stomach so they can reach inside the stomach of the cow to get samples anytime they want. And remember, cows eat grass. Grass is cellulose. So in cow's stomach, there's a lot of different kinds of cellulase to digest the grass they eat, and then it becomes glucose that they can use. Now let's talk about fermentation. We'll talk about fermentation toward the end. Cell respiration, but let's do a quick overview right now. So fermentation requires glucose, right? And the reason that it requires glucose is because yeast, that's what we use to ferment in this lab, love sugar, love glucose. And when yeast eats sugar like glucose, it will turn it into CO2, alcohol, and a little bit of energy, okay? And you kind of know this process already. When you make beer, okay, that you put yeast with sugar, usually it's maltose, and then the yeast will turn the sugar into CO2, that's the bubbles in beers, and alcohol. Okay, so different kinds of microorganisms. So in particular, yeast will make beer, make bread, make wine, but there are other microorganisms besides yeast can do fermentation. For example, when you have cheese, you're using a bacteria to turn sugar, which is the lactose, is the sugar in milk, go through fermentation and make cheese. Soy sauce is the same thing. You have another organism that turns the sugar in the soybeans into ferment it and then into different things. Okay, but what we're going to focus on is making beer right here in this lab. You want to break down the cellulose in the biomass that you have into glucose, and then you're going to add yeast to the glucose. Yeast will eat it and turn it into CO2 and ethanol, and you will measure the ethanol, how much ethanol that you get at the end. Okay, so there are multiple steps in this. So how efficient is biofuel or conversion of biomass to biofuel? Actually, it's not very efficient right now. That's why a lot of research is going into it. So the estimate is converting switchgrass, which is a weed, into ethanol. Actually, sometimes it costs more energy to do that than the energy at the end you'll get. So they're still trying to figure out what is a better way to convert the biomass into biofuel. And here's what it's showing you, okay, how they spend, what kind of energy they have to spend to convert the biomass. Of course, they have to use electricity, right? They have to grind it, right? And then they have to take it everywhere. And then the part that spend the most energy is steaming it, cooking it. Remember I said the pre-treatment step, you cook it. So steaming the biomass also take a lot of energy. So here's the last slide about conclusion. So far, how are we doing? So when we make corn ethanol, it's a little bit more expensive than gasoline, but it's not that far away. Okay. Soybean biodiesel is about this much, while regular diesel is about this much. So it's a little bit more expensive, but it's not that bad. But the problem is if we use all the corn in the US to make biofuel, it will only meet 12% of our nation's gasoline demand. So that's not enough. That's the problem. That's why, these days, biofuels is a major research focus because they want to find out how to make energy the cheap way. So we don't have to rely on other people, so we can have a better economy and stuff like this. Okay. Now I'm going to give you a couple minutes. Is there any question? If not, we're going to take a break.